I've been playing around with my own revision to the height scales because I've thrown out Height's model, which I think is wrong. And I've rejiggered his items to make a better version of his scale, where instead of measuring these stupid 5 moral foundations, I found that really there's just 2, and that the best way of getting at how they actually collapse into the political left-right continuum is to have a tilt. So you have individualizing and binding moral foundations, and then you just compute the difference score between them. And that gives you a left and a right. It's quite nice, actually, because people high on binding tend to be high on group-oriented behaviors. They tend to be high on religion, they tend to be high on community orientation. Whereas people who are high on individualizing also tend to be overly concerned with equality and their own status relative to others. So, really there's just this one dimension there, and I've been finding that it correlates quite strongly with measures of home brokenness. Whether there's been experiences of violence in the childhood environment, we've got correlations between individualizing tilt and having come from a home where the subject was exposed to violence as a child. So, it looks like violence in the home may begat leftist moral foundations through possibly some epigenetic route.
Well, you're saying that people who are leftist are more likely to have experienced violence in the home.
Yes, that's right. It could also be that there are genetic correlations there between genes that predispose one towards dysfunctionality and violence, and also genes that predispose one towards being incredibly self rather than other focused, as that seems to be characteristic of those who score high on these individualizing moral foundations. And we found a lot of the concern for equality is not born out of an existential concern for people. It's born out of a, where do I rank relative to others, and how can I pull others down towards me? And how can I level the playing field in my favor?
Gerhard Meisenberg has done a very interesting book review of Superior by Angela Saini, in which he argues this is true of her, that she is only interested in those who are in her group, and you're only in her group if you're equal to her. And if you're not equal to her, then you're not in her group. So it's the ultimate selfishness.
Yeah, the big idea I've been trying to tie my head around, which is based on the idea that it doesn't make sense initially to think of people who are highly individualistic as being also high on equality preferences. But when you think about it in this way, it makes a lot of sense. Moreover, it leads one to the conclusion that there exists a form of positive and negative egalitarianism. Just as there are positive and negative forms of ethnocentrism and misogyny, there are also positive and negative forms of egalitarianism. And the egalitarianism, which is based on leveling and elimination of differences in order to raise comparative advantage, would be a negative species of egalitarianism. Whereas the egalitarianism where you're concerned about the overall condition of the poor and you believe that there's some role for charity in ameliorating the hardships of what the Victorian era referred to as the deserving poor. Or conversely, you are someone who is very concerned with the possibility of people becoming so wealthy that in so doing, they start to damage the interests of their corporate polity. That form of egalitarianism, which is not a leftist egalitarianism, it's more of a kind of rightist egalitarianism, because it often deals with traditional notions of how societies should be structured and put together and limited. If you look at distributism as a model of economics, for example, and the social teachings of the Catholic Church in the 20s and 30s and things, you can see lots of evidence of this positive egalitarianism, where it's born out of a real concern for how excessive inequality can damage the corporate well-being.
Sorry, these negative egalitarians, they want to suppress the evidence of the existence of differences between groups of people.
Well, they don't want to suppress evidence of the existence of differences. They're happy to accept that there are differences. It's the etiology of the differences. They don't want any talk about the differences being caused by genetics. They're very happy to talk about the differences being caused by oppression. So, they get very uncomfortable if you point out that socioeconomic status and IQ are genetically correlated, and actually share variance through a common set of apparently causal variance. They don't like you using polygenic scores for IQ to predict differences in educational attainment and socioeconomic status.
Why do you think that's the case?
It's a very interesting question. I have to think about it some more. This is something I want to get at through scale construction. I actually want to try and build a scale and instrument that I can validate, that can measure and differentiate between these two types of egalitarianism, just as there are scales for positive and negative ethnocentrism, which have already been validated. I would like to build a similar one for egalitarianism. But as to why that might be the case, maybe these people who are high on negative egalitarianism, as Darwin says, bear the indelible stamp of their lowly origins. And they don't want to think any aspect of their past or any aspect of their immediate familial history is an impediment to their perceived actual social success.
It struck me as consistent with what you were saying about left-wing people having had more violent childhoods. And they, on some sort of cognitive dissonance level, realize that nature is red in tooth and claw, and they are a product of that. That's what's made them who they are, these big genetic indelible differences. And they just can't deal with knowing that.
Well, actually, a colleague of mine who's been teaching for a very, very long period of time, he has noted anecdotally that those who are the most resistant to behavior genetic perspectives are typically those who self-identify as having come from a background of dysfunctionality. And they don't want to think that their background, in terms of their familial background and the generally dysfunctional context from which they arose, could play any kind of a role in making them who they are. They want to believe in a super free will. They want your person and your process of self-actualization to be completely decoupled from genetic constraints. And they want this process of personal evolution, essentially, to be entirely independent of anything that could hold them back.
Our character is entirely in our own hands. Don't forget that, my baby.